So much for pride. We have a good sense now of the philosophy of pride in medieval Europe, broadly understood, between 500 and 1500. We have an understanding of the spectrum of ideas in which pride is appreciated. We have a sense that, I think we have a sense that it can be politicized, but we haven't really explored this too much. That is to say, accusations of pride can be a way to delegitimize would-be rebels. I think you can think of other examples. Although I would love to talk about that, we're going to focus really on religious ways of fighting pride. In the lecture that follows, Fighting Pride, we're going to talk about two figures. Well, we're going to talk about five figures, but these two are the most prominent. These two are the architects of a certain kind of medieval thought, and specifically thought on humility, the opposite of pride, or a way of fighting pride, or a way of fighting the individual. There is an enormous paradox at the heart of everything related to these two individuals and how they approached Christianity and their lives generally, which is, you want to fight pride, you want to be the anti-individual, you want to make yourself so you are nothing in the eyes of God, or so that you love God so much that you feel that everything is for God, or from God, and nothing is your own. You want to self-annihilate. These two men are the princes of medieval self-annihilation, destruction of the self. They represent two very different ways of doing it, under the same family of monasticism. But there is the paradox that they also become attractive, magnetic figures in their own right. And so the paradox is, they fought pride, they tried to self-annihilate, but then they actually become more than selves, saints, the great saints of the church, icons. And really, in their own lifetimes, these two men were icons. Who are these two men? Well, it's written there, but you might not be able to make it out. First is Bernard of Clairvaux, Bernard of Clairvaux, however you want to say it. He is a monastic figure from the 12th century, a monk, the most dynamic of the monks, more than a monk, much, much more. If you think of like Angela Merkel and everything she is to Europe, still, this is this guy in the 12th century. More than a politician, more than a figure who transcends all the others in power, importance, influence, and so on. And Francis of Assisi is the second figure. Now, I'm sure you've definitely heard of Saint Francis. You probably have heard of Saint Bernard. They name a species of dog after Saint Bernard, which is a shame. That's what he's. If you Google Saint Bernard, you get pictures of all these dogs. So he has kind of self-annihilated in that way. Francis of Assisi needs no introduction. Obviously, he is the most notorious saint, I think, of the Middle Ages. Notorious is probably the wrong word. I have to fight my own obsession and love for Saint Francis of Assisi, so I'm trying not to say brilliant saint. This is my problem. We can help me deal with it, I hope. Why are they significant? You know, Dante, if Dante's entire universe, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, is an attempt to purge himself of the seven deadly sins, which is what it becomes in Purgatorio. If it's an attempt to become the perfect human being and to face the worst of humanity in Inferno, and then to purge the sins one by one, pride being the most important in the Purgatorio, with Satan at the center of the Inferno as some horrible idea of what happens when you start to believe in yourself too much. Who is at the top of that universe? Who is the most divine figure of them all, other than God? The last person that Dante sees before he sees God is Bernard of Clairvaux. That's how much Dante respected Bernard, but it's also a measure of just how important his thought was. And Bernard died in 1153. Dante's writing 150 years later, and yet still Bernard, most important. It's like putting Dostoevsky or someone at the top. Makes sense, still important to you now. Francis needs no introduction, but I'm still going to give you an introduction. Now, looking at these two figures, we're going to ask the question, what did they do to fight pride? What practices did they initiate? How did they work? And that's really all the lecture will be, other than introducing three other characters as we go. And if you were worried that medieval history is too full of men, it's true, it is. it's not our fault as much. Well, it is sort of our fault for focusing on them, but it's definitely also their fault for being massively patriarchal and for meaning that most women are not experiencing education in the same way. But there are loads of brilliant exceptions, one of whom is Hildegard of Bingen, we'll be reading about. But there are three wonderful exceptions that I want to focus on, because these are three writers who take the ideas of Bernard of Clairvaux and Francis of Assisi and move them in new directions. And they are different kinds of exemplars of fighting pride. Some of them are heroic. Angela of Foligno was made into a saint just last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago. She's now Saint Angela. Some of them are not heroic, and in fact devastating. You'll see what happens to Marguerite Porete later, and Hallowig too. Okay, so that is the scheme of the lecture. So Bernard and Francis will structure things. So if you're thinking about when should I pay attention to what, we're starting with Bernard. And we're starting here, somewhere in the Champagne region of France in the early 12th century. This is how I want to introduce you to Bernard of Clairvaux, because I think it tells you so much about his personality, of this really tortured figure. This man who used to give his sermons with a bucket next to him so he could vomit into it, because he had this really bad gastric problem. This man who spent 40 years, was it, giving sermons, lectures on one book of the Bible, the Song of Songs, over and over and over again, line by line. What does this line mean? Come back next week for the next line. But actually he would spend next week talking about the same line again. An obsessive character, someone who would make it to the top of Dante's Paradiso. How to introduce him? I think the lake is the place to start. When he's a young man, he's not yet a monk. He actually has, I forget the exact number, but he has many, many brothers, Bernard. He has several siblings, lots of them, and all of them are quasi-aristocratic. They're fairly wealthy. They're not like, they're not peasants on the land. They have a bit more something to them. They have land behind them or beneath them. They own it. The assumption is that some of these boys will become knights, that they will have access to resources, that they will get a sword and a shield and a horse, and, become part of 12th century establishment life insofar as it's possible. Not for Bernard. And it all goes wrong at the lake, or maybe it all goes right. He's here, and this is the story as it's told in the life written by, I think it's William of Saint-Thierry, his companion, disciple. Bernard's on this lake, he's just had a swim, and he hasn't had a swim, sorry. Bernard's at the side of this lake, maybe it's a picnic, and he sees across this lake this beautiful woman. She's somewhere over here, maybe. This beautiful woman, she's getting undressed. Maybe she's going to swim or something. And Bernard is gripped by lust. He sees this woman and he has lust. And he chooses to act on it by throwing himself with his clothes on straight in the lake. And this is so Bernard of Clairvaux. He was horrified by his own appetites and desires. He was horrified by his own potential for sin. And he took drastic, slightly eccentric, neurotic action to purge himself of it. Now, the interesting thing about Bernard is the lust that he felt when he sees this woman undressing across the lake kind of structures his religious life that follows. He never stops feeling those feelings, I don't think. He develops a whole system of Christian philosophy which would develop those feelings and channel them towards God. What does this mean? Lust in itself, for Bernard of Clairvaux, and we probably should have talked about this in the last week, but generally speaking, the passions, they can be redirected towards God. So the lust is a good thing insofar as it feels right, but it needs to be redirected. And this helps us to understand his view on pride as well, that the good Christian life is not necessarily about destroying yourself and making yourself into something new and simple, a monk who would be pure and holy and nothing. It's actually about taking what you already have and redirecting it back to God. That's the Bernard way. I don't think he ever lost that lust and that appetite. It's just he found a way to Christianize it at the highest level. here are his dates. What soon follows after this moment, actually, is Bernard decides he wants to join a monastery. Not a surprise, okay. He sees himself as, and you could make even a Marxist analysis, material relationships. Bernard had no hope of inheriting land. You know, this was a pretty good choice for him, a monastery. But whatever the reason is, it means a lot to him. They say that he was so strong about his commitment. Well, the first thing he does is he takes all his brothers with him. He manages to convert all of his brothers to join him, and they all go off to join the Cistercian monastery, which is brand new. It had been founded by Robert of Malem in the late 1000s. It's a new institution. What are the Cistercians? Well, Bernard, being the pure kind of guy he wanted to be, but knew he wasn't, Bernard wanted the purest of the pure. And the Cistercians were the purest of the pure choice. So not all monks are alike, as I'm sure you can imagine. By this period, the late 1100s, the early 12th century, we've got to a situation where lots of people are criticizing the old monasteries. Have you ever been around one of these Cluniac monasteries? They would say, look, it's just full of, there's just too much stuff. There's clutter everywhere. You know, there's all this gold, there's all of these little silly pictures, there's all this decoration. And it's just like they're so wrapped up in the decoration, in the image of Christianity, that they've forgotten what it's supposed to be really about. Classic formula, repeated basically anytime there's any reform, basically in history, these ingredients are always there, aren't they? We're sick of the old institution, it's become corrupt, let's make something purer. Well, the Cistercians are the purest of the pure, but they live it, okay? So if you're a Cistercian monk, you only wear white, okay? You all wear white. It's not like these black monks, they wear black habits, or the ones who wear brown habits. No, because white is the purest color. It's so simple, so stupid maybe, but this is the idea. Embody the purity, wear the white habit. Of course, they all have the tonsure with the hair. They're a little bit more pure than that, and this is why Bernard likes them. The Cistercians have a policy where they don't take children, which, okay, fair enough, a no children entry policy, but this is more radical than you might think. You may not have realized how many children there were in monasteries. It was quite customary, if there's a child that you can't keep for some reason, or you just want to get rid of, I can't imagine the circumstances, they're often given to monasteries. Or sometimes a family, they have 4 kids and they say, well, you know, we've got enough children now, we've had one more. Well, give it to a monastery and then it can grow up and pray for us. You know, these things would happen. Like, it's a donation to the community. The Cistercians are different. They don't believe this. Why do they think it's wrong? Well, for the reasons you might imagine. So imagine these kids all grow up. And why are they here? Well, because, I don't know, my parents didn't love me. I've been put here. I don't know. You know, it's not exactly... is that the kind of workplace you want to be in? Is that the kind of environment you want to be surrounded by? Loads of people who are only here because they were forced and had no choice. The Cistercians were all about choice. The ideal of the early Cistercians was, everyone is here because they chose to be here. How brilliant. Imagine a university where people are only there because they were forced to go by their parents. Well, anyway, let's not imagine it. But this is the ideal university. You've chosen to go there. So Bernard believes in all of that. So no oblates, no kids. It's only people who've chosen to be there. There's kind of an elitism about this. It's like, we're the purer monks. We all know what we're doing here. You know, we're really focused. I think that's what Bernard is into. And right away, he becomes one of the more intellectual figures, and we'll talk about that in just one second. Another thing to know about these Cistercian monasteries, which I think is interesting when we're talking about pride and the world and politics, and you know how these things can be used as critique. The Cistercians are so pure that they situate their monasteries far, far away from everyone else. And this is key. They want to be in the wilderness. They want to be away from the other people. And then later on, when these guys get torn to shreds by their critics, that's one of the things that they accuse them of, the pride of separating themselves. We Cistercians are better than the others. We live over here, away from all the dirty people. Maybe I'm painting a negative image. The Cistercians are phenomenal for what they do. They are electrifying. Millions of, well, not millions, but really tens of thousands of people are joining these monasteries, and they grow throughout Europe. There's a whole network. Like, in every major region, we will have a Cistercian monastery or 2 or 3, and they're super organized. You know, they're not like casual about it. They have this network, and everyone knows where they belong in the hierarchy, and so on. Bernard ends up being right at the top of that. Here's one of his sermons on conversion, And here's where humility and pride come in. So Bernard, immediately, obviously an evangelist for the order of the Cistercians, he goes out and preaches. He wants everyone to become a Cistercian. One argument is that Bernard thought the ideal humanity would be, rather than a few elitists living in monasteries, if everyone became a monk. Everyone was as dedicated as he was to fighting their own inner pride and all their other inner sins, and became pure for the love of God. They say that lock up all your sons when Bernard of Clairvaux comes to town was a phrase at this point, you know, and for the reason that he would convert them. Now, others made other accusations about what that meant. Lock up all your sons when Bernard came. Let's not throw slanders around. Don't you realize your humility is imperiled? Flee from the middle of Babylon. Flee and save your souls. Flee together to the cities of refuge where you can do penance. This is a classic kind of, and note the trope of Babylon here. Note the trope of Babylon there, often appearing in medieval ideas. You know, that there are two cities, city of Babylon and Jerusalem. Babylon represents that city of man full of pride. Jerusalem represents that city of God, of Augustine's. But don't you realize your humility is imperiled? So Bernard is a critic of the cities, after all. Be careful in cities, they're places of pride. To move on just more earnestly, you can't really see the steps. This is a shame. There's actually a staircase depicted there. Bernard, one of the first things he writes, actually, are these steps of humility and pride. So in his early intellectual blossoming as a Cistercian, as a monk, as an intellectual, Bernard dedicates himself to this question of pride and what it is that can corrupt the soul, why they should join a Cistercian monastery, what they should do while they're there, what's wrong with the lives they've been leading. And here are Bernard of Clairvaux's 12 steps of pride. I wonder if you imagine to yourself, what is the first step of pride? What is the first step? What is the very first thing? You know, if you're going to become Lucifer, basically, if you're going to become, you believe that you're better than everyone else and you have wings that will sail off into the sunset, what is the first step? Can anyone give me an Arseny in flames?
Do you think you have some power?
So already believing you have some power.
At least some power.
At least some power.
That you have all of the power in the world, at least to some degree.
Throwing off the anti-free will ideas and immediately beginning with just even free will then could be. Anne?
Willing for something you don't have yet.
Okay, so already the desire for something else is pride. Okay, so recognizing, thinking you should have something. You deserve to, that's a good, Marianne?
Well, if we consider the previous example of Breaking Bad, maybe that's like the moment realization that you don't need. Maybe maybe you need the problem to understand that you are the one who can solve the problem, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so some sort of tension or crisis in your life that makes you think you need something else or that you haven't got what's sufficient. These are all interesting and good answers, but you're not thinking as cruelly, perhaps, as a medieval theologian would. It's even more elemental. It's actually curiosity. It's the first step of pride for Bernard. It's even being curious. So Arseny, it might be, I wonder if I have free will or not. As terrible as that is, the very act of wondering. This is pretty. If we don't read this carefully, and obviously you don't have the text, but if you did read the text, we should be. It's not all curiosity, but it's that curiosity of I wonder if things could be better for me. I wonder if there could be another way that I could live. And it's hard to understand this. I don't think Bernard is saying, because after all, he was curious about Cistercian monasteries, and then he joined one. It's not curiosity as such. It's more that curiosity about thinking about your own situation in relation to others. I wonder where Arseny gets his hair cut. I wonder how, oh, that's a nice shirt. I wonder. It's just already that beginning. It's not necessarily like curiosity as such. Next up, and this is harsh too, levity of mind. Actually, I can put the next two together. Laughter. For Bernard, it's interesting. This is where pride begins. Is like you said. So I just start to think. I wonder how things are different for Arseny. There are a few things different. I wonder. For me, I wonder. And then levity of mind is like, you start to. You break out of a sort of seriousness to start to take things a little bit lightly. So this is quite subtle at this stage. Like, I suppose it's a nice shirt. Just bit lightness about it. Yeah, it's just a shirt after all. I'm starting to pay attention to things, small things. Laughing now is actually really where things start to get a little bit serious, because I'm starting to notice, I'm accentuating differences between you and me. I shouldn't pick on you, Arseny, but maybe like you trip over your shoelaces, You wouldn't do that, you're too graceful, but let's say you did. Arseny fell, he's always making these mistakes, I might say. And it's that laughter there, it's that kind of like, I'm starting to accentuate a difference between him and me. I'm starting to build some kind of theory of difference. This is where pride begins for Bernard of Clairvaux. So actually it's nothing so large as, I am better, I am powerful. It's actually just starting to recognize the differences and to think about them and make them important. Of course, boasting follows that. That's maybe not so surprising. I never slip over my shoelaces. In fact, I buy the best shoes there are, and the laces always stay stuck together. It's a little bit silly, but it's like, okay, so it makes sense. I focus on someone else's failing, and then I boast about my own. Singularity. I'm the only one who could have shoes like that, I suppose. I suppose it's because I always go to the best shops, and I think about these things, and I guess others just don't pay as much attention to the way they dress. Yeah, that's the difference. I'm singular. You see, this is how it begins. And then, of course, self-conceit. It's because of who I am, isn't it? It's because of who I am. It's probably because I suppose I've always been like this. You see, this is the disgusting, slippery slope that Bernard tries to lay out. Presumption, then. Presuming, well, of course I deserve to be first in the queue. Well, of course I should speak first. Because, all these great things. The presumption, which, of course, presumption is a specific category here for thinking about what you deserve over others. That slips for Bernard as we go down the staircase, self-justification. Well, everything I do, I made these mistakes, but they're justified. They're justified because, I am who I am, and I deserve to do these things. Of course I'm going to make small mistakes. So this is where we go to. Hypocrisy then, of course, follows that for Bernard's. Well, you shouldn't be able to do that. I mean, I did that, but it's different for me because of all these other things. But you shouldn't be able to do that. It's hypocrisy. And then, of course, revolt. Well, none of us should listen anymore to, insert the figure here, Abbot Dimitri. None of us should listen to Dimitri because, it's ridiculous. I should be in charge. He doesn't deserve it. It's revolt, rebellion. And then, of course, freedom to sin. Total freedom. What follows that? Corruption of office or corruption. I've just dethroned Dimitri as abbot, and now I'm so proud that I say, right, I'm going to be corrupt, I'm going to embezzle money, I'm going to do things, because I believe now it's totally justified. And then, of course, habitual sin is the end point for Bernard. This is how you end up. If you're not following his steps, you end up in habitual sin. You're basically, by this point, it's so habituated, it's so within your, what do they call it?
Nature?
Yeah. What was the word that Bourdieu uses? Habitus. Yeah, nature, same thing, basically. It's there. And so for Bernard, this is the story. What's remarkable about this? There's nothing remarkable as such. It tallies with a lot of what had been written before. What I think is interesting is for Bernard, we get into some real specifics, and just the relationship of levity and curiosity and laughter in particular, such small things, to now be considered part of the diabolical journey of a Lucifer. That's intriguing. But for Bernard of Clairvaux, if there's one thing that you should know in terms of his fighting pride, there's kind of two dimensions to it. On the one, there is what you do with your daily life, with your body. The way to fight all of those things is to just not try to be different, right? So don't be curious about Arseny and everything. I should respect Arseny and respect the fact that we are a community together and that we shouldn't focus on our differences, we should focus on our similarities. So what does this mean in practice? Well, you've already heard about it. We all wear the same clothes, we all have the same haircut, we all have the same speech, we say our prayers, we have a same common language. And these things are so important for creating the modular human. So how do you fight pride? Well, we all become the same. It could be depressing for you. It could be uplifting for you. Through the thing, it looks depressing, extremely depressing to us, I think. But through that very humbling of self, for Bernard, was the true liberation. This is how you will have your total singularity and uniqueness in the afterlife is through going through this self-annihilating journey of becoming one and the same. Do the same activities day after day. The Cistercians would do, there was a lot of planting and cultivating vegetables, there was a lot of sheep farming, laboriously shearing wool. They actually became very rich from all this wool, by the way. This is a kind of dirty aspect of the Cistercian life. But it's the same stuff over and over, and saying prayers, so many prayers, but they mix it up. They mix it up, you do all three. So that's one version of fighting pride. The other, though, is this love. It's the psychological for Bernard. It's the love of God. Now, what does it mean for someone like Bernard of Clairvaux to describe the love of God? And Anne, you asked the interesting question earlier about love of God, love for God. What is this relationship of love? Bernard gives us the most sophisticated version of this. And I believe, in essence, I already told you about the water in wine aspect, that self-annihilation for Bernard should be like a droplet of water splashes into wine, and it's indistinguishable. It's now part of the wine. Love for Bernard of Clairvaux is an engine which will bring you back to God. It is the engine. It is like the sacred clue that has been left in humanity that will lead us back to where we should be. This is actually a Platonic idea, I think you see. Bernard would have got that from his deep love of Augustine. I think that's where Plato's coming through to Bernard. He's not reading Plato for himself. But this idea that there is a shard within us that will lead us back to the divine. For Bernard, yes, it is a clue in our fabric of our being. The one thing that remains in us of God is that divine feeling, which is love. And for Bernard, that's it. So when he was in the lake and he saw this beautiful woman and he jumped in, that feeling is still valid for Bernard. That was like a clue of where he should go. It's just it was the wrong object. The woman of his affections was the wrong object. It was a clue to lead him back to the true love, which is love of God. Let's have a quote. He wrote a wonderful treatise. Well, the Sermon on the Canticles, this is the sermons I was talking about, the ones he did for 40 years, the same topic, the Song of Songs. You will know yourself as you are when the very experience of the love and affection that you bear yourself reveals to you that there is nothing in you deserving of your love, unless it be on his account, without whom you yourself have no existence. Interesting. So you know yourself, the very experience of the love and affection that you bear yourself. Okay, so you do begin to love yourself, but again, you realize the limit of it. And then you redirect it, you find the right object. For Bernard, you start by loving yourself for yourself. Then you end up loving God for God's sake. And it's a journey through which, and it's the same love, it's just you start to recognize that there's a limit. As he said famously in his sermon it's called On Loving God, it's love of God is the only love that can be quenched. All other forms of love cannot be quenched, which is to say they cannot be fulfilled. So if you love yourself, where does it end? You can't just, for Bernard, he recognized, and this is where I think we should respect him as someone who is a deeply psychologically sophisticated thinker. I think, like you, when you have reflected on human psychology, on your drives, your passions, what motivates you in your lives, you will come, I think, you may come to very similar conclusions as even a monastic thinker. Where does it lead me, this love? If you really think that everything should be about yourself in life, there will come a time when you may realize, where does it end? If I keep pleasing myself, where does it go? You know, and for Bernard, the answer is to say, well, that's an answer to a theological dilemma, that love of self is obviously incomplete. And for him, the only love that can actually keep expanding, can lead somewhere, can be fulfilled, is love of God. Why? Well, because it's fulfilled in the afterlife. It's fulfilled with eternal union with God. For Bernard of Clairvaux, and for Dante, incidentally, the height of heaven, of paradise, is this merging of self with God in this mystical act where the two are indistinguishable. The water is now wine. The human self, whatever you were, has become one with God. That's the end point. That's the end point of fighting pride. The counterintuitive aspect of it is, when you were proud in life, you thought you were everything and others were lesser. But when you're humble in life, for Bernard, the result is you become the most powerful thing there is. You become God. Now, be careful how you phrase that, because if you get it wrong, and a lot of them did get it wrong, then you would be open to being burnt at the stake as a terrible heretic for saying, I am already God. I had a vision of God. I've already become one with God. This thing becomes complicated. That was my brief introduction to Bernard of Clairvaux. I hope it I hope it makes sense. He's a deeply rich and intriguing figure who I just encourage you to read. His famous quotation was actually the opposite of someone like Aquinas. "I believe in order that I may understand," was a Bernard quote. You don't go about finding knowledge because you want to question God or question the universe. First of all, look into your heart and find out the truth there, and then use your reason to understand why that is the case. For Bernard, the answer is already there. The answer is the purpose of life is union with God. Pride is wrong, humility is correct. This is the pathway that you should follow. That's already there. It's just reason, and education is just about finding why that's right. It's like when you have a math problem and the answer's already there and you have to do the working. Depressing as that may be for you, that's Bernard's view of the world. I want to just talk about, I want to go to Brabant in the Low Countries. Bernard was so popular, right? His sermons on the Song of Songs were translated into all sorts of languages so that people could read them for themselves, which is pretty astonishing. These are sermons about one text in the Bible, bless you, which he did for so long, but they were popular. And what's interesting about this is Bernard's quite an elite figure. It's all happening. It's just him, some men, he's preaching. But it has a life of its own after that. Like Dante's one example, where Bernard's ideas live on. In Brabant, we get this really interesting phenomenon around about the 1200s, the early 1200s, where groups of women start to meet together in small communities and just, get away from other forms of community and have their own discussions. They're not quite monastic. They're not living like this forever. They stay within their cities, but they form what we call beguinages. They become beguines, that's the word. Beguines, if you want to look it up. And here, what do? They write poetry, they pray, they say confessions, they do all kinds of devotional activities in a small community. It's a little bit like a reading group, only it's a bit more formal. They do spend more time together. There's some suspicion about these groups, not least because they're women, and you won't be surprised to know that sometimes a male bishop gets sent in and says, "Hi guys, I'm just here to observe." And a lot of the time their writings are carefully written down by a man who comes in and listens and writes it down. But they do produce some wonderful writers. Among them is Hadewig of Brabant. We don't know too much about her life circumstances, but we know she's a member of one of these beguinages, and we know her writings which survive, some of which are theological meditations, many of which are poems. And these poems themselves, I think, take Bernard of Clairvaux's ideas of divine love, and they give them this new dimension. It might be going too far to say they take on a feminist dimension, but it's definitely there as an element. They certainly take on an anti-establishment dimension. They certainly take on a more secularized dimension, or what Bernard McGinn, the theologian, calls the democratization of Christianity. Democratization, the making plural of what Christianity means and how it's discussed. Let's look at one of her poems. Whatever vicissitudes men lead me through, whatever struggles men lead me through, for love's sake, I wish to stand firm and take no harm from them. For I understand from the nobility of my soul that in suffering for sublime love, I conquer. It's not difficult to see the feminist dimension here, in the sense of whatever vicissitudes men lead me through, for love's sake, I wish to stand firm and take no harm from them. I think we're talking about secular love there. She's saying, whatever struggles some man who falls in love with me, wants to lead me through, I'm standing firm and I'm saying, no, I'm not involving myself in that. For I understand from the nobility of my soul that in suffering for sublime love, I conquer. Right, so the sublime love is much like Bernard's here. It is the sense of the love which leads towards God. She is a firm believer in that kind of love. And notice, on the one hand, here's the humility, which is, I'm going to suffer. It's what Mariam, you were saying. Like, the more I suffer, the more perfect I can be. That logic is there. Like, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to purge myself of any kind of worldly love. And she's going to conquer through that. She's going to gain the kingdom of heaven, as Hugh of St. Victor would have said. But notice this, the nobility of my soul. It's complicated. She recognises she has a soul herself, which is noble. She also recognises some difference with the men who try to persuade her towards something or other. I think this is much more like Thomas Aquinas' view of what pride is. There's nothing wrong with saying I have a noble soul and saying I don't need to listen to everyone. It's proportionate to reason. It's not total humiliation for the Lord. Anyway, I hope you might check out Hadwick at some point. Hadwick is definitely on the less problematic end of the spectrum when it comes to using Bernard's ideas and making kind of almost a political statement with them. If we go to this figure, this is from, she's from northern France, Marguerite Porete, then things are much, much darker. Marguerite Porete is a fantastic writer from around about the same time as Dante. She writes a book called The Mirror for Simple Souls, in which she describes herself simply throughout as the soul. Does she call herself the creature? I forget. But it's simple, right? She is the simple soul. She humiliates herself in this text. She describes, and here's the 5-stage process of this text. This text, by the way, that only survived, I believe, in one copy. It may be just a few more copies than that. But it was burnt, this text. It was burnt. It was condemned. She describes 7 stages of grace. She describes how, in a higher phase, the human soul, like herself, comes to live in God's love in this life. That's the difference. You fall in love, love for God. In this life, you are in love with God. And eventually this soul, who is living, not dead in heaven, but living in this world, has no will or desire, only God's. So you're walking around and everything you do is only God's desire. You know, so look, I'm being stupid, but you know, it's the idea that you're not in control of your actions anymore insofar as an individual agent. You're now God's agent on earth. The soul is essentially not understood, you know, goes through a stage where rejected by others, in the world around them, people criticize, and finally the soul is annihilated by love. So in Margaret's journey, in this Mirror of Simple Souls, and it's like a classic medieval treatise, like there's just so many stages and layers. First you're going to do this, then you're going to do that, then you're going to purge your animal self and become more rational. Medieval treatises are full of these. Treatises are full of this sort of idea. There are a few things to point out. The goal is annihilation of self. Okay, fair enough, much like Bernard. It's a little bit more practical, though, for Marguerite Porete, because it seems to happen during this life. If you fall in love with God and you unify your will with him, then there's nothing to stop that happening in this life, and there's nothing to stop you being in the world and performing this stuff. This was really, really difficult to swallow for lots of reasons for people in authority. And she is tried as a heretic, along with this other guy who she associates with, who calls himself the Angel of Philadelphia, who I think is much more problematic in thinking himself already an angel. He believes himself to be the angel who will come at the time of the Last Judgment, you know, so, okay. I'm sure there are still people today who think that, but they don't get as much publicity anymore. Margaret is a huge case. She's tried. She's made an example of. Now, why is it problematic? It's not that different from Bernard of Clairvaux. The difference, of course, is the claims of what she can and cannot do on this earth because of her authority. Marguerite Porete makes the claim that even if she were to commit a crime, if it was God's will, it would be okay. And of course, all kinds of other sins could be justified. And actually, a lot of their critics say basically this is like some sexual cult. They call it the heresy of the free spirit. And it persists as an idea. And basically, their accusers say, they're just into sort of orgies, basically, and they justify it as God's love on earth. That tells us not much about Marguerite Porete. It tells us a lot about the accusers and their fantasies. You see the same accusations made of witches later on. It's basically all just a sex cult. This is often what happens, right? The result, unfortunately, for Margaret is this. On June 1st, 1310, she is burnt at the stake. It is hideous, and the book is burnt as well. I think it should be a reminder for us that fighting pride can have its own political threats. And when you say that you reject worldly authority, that can obviously be a political statement. When you say God is the only authority and all political leaders are proud insofar as they believe their word is higher than, more important than God's, this works if you're in a monastery and you're not really a threat. But when you're out there telling this to people and you're a threat to the King of France, for example, then this is how it can end. I should say that this was a royal decision, not an ecclesiastical one. This is a moment of political punishment, not religious punishment. Okay, so that's one of the stakes of fighting pride. Any questions about Bernard or Marguerite before I move on?
Didn't the Margaret thought on Judas who betrayed Christ? As far as I understand, it was at God's will. God knew that Judas will betray Christ, and Christ knew that Judas is going to betray him, and Christ let him do that. He literally told him, go to the soldiers and tell them where I am, for them to arrest me. However, Judas committed suicide after that and went to hell. So it was not forgiven by God. Did Margaret thought on it? When she said that if one commits a crime, it's okay if it's by will of God.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know whether Margaret writes about that in The Mirror of Simple Souls. What I would say is, this is a problem in theology that's never resolved. So, and I know that's a cop-out, but it's just not resolved. So different writers, like the problem is like in the book of Job, right, where the devil appears, the devil is actually doing God's work. You know, Job only worships you because he's got a lovely life. Wouldn't it be nice, God, if I persecute him and then we'll see if he still worships you? And God says, okay. You know, so the devil is just helping God, you know, and yet it's still right at the bottom of hell in ice. And it's strange. And the same with Judas. Yes, your point is a good one. Did God will it to happen, or was it counter to God? Is it a force in its own right fighting God, or is it part of God's plan? We'd have to read Marguerite and see what she says. I don't actually think she writes about Judas, but we could look it up. I don't know how she would resolve that one. I don't know how it's possible to resolve that one. I'm sure it's the big problem of why is there evil in the first place? Is it part of God's plan, or is it counter to it? Why are there earthquakes? Is that part of God's plan? They kill people. Well, it's not something that's been resolved theologically very convincingly. You can debate about it, but it's not solved. And I don't think Marguerite, maybe her system of thought can solve that at some level, but I don't want to gamble on what her answer is there. Any other questions? Let's move to Umbria in the 13th century, and a different kind of fighting pride, and my other favourite saint, but it's not just my favourites. I think that these guys become paradigmatic. This is Umbria. It's rolling hill land in the centre of Italy, and it's here in the early 13th century that this figure emerges. This is a different story, though. This is a different story, and this is the example of when annihilating yourself in the current life can work. But some would argue it shouldn't have worked. Some would say, really, that Francis of Assisi should have had the same fate as Marguerite Porete, that he should have ended up on a bonfire. And in fact, there's a man much like Francis of Assisi 30 years before, Valdez, who does not achieve sainthood within the church, who is condemned for something very, very similar. What is that similar thing? Who is Saint Francis of Assisi? Let's just go to some basic testimonies. Thomas of Solano writes his life. By his actions, he taught his brothers that they should regard themselves as ashes. You see that humility is central. Bonaventure, the contemporary of Thomas Aquinas, theologian, it was whispered into his spirit that spiritual capital has its beginning in the contempt of the world, and that the warfare of Christ is to be begun by victory over self. Basically, what I'm trying to show here, I suppose, is that all writers are agreed that if there's something that made Francis of Assisi particular, it was this contempt for self, this war on pride within oneself, this attempt to become ashes, to become nothing. This might not be the story of Francis that you're more familiar with. I'm going to give you a really, 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 really brief version of his life. Here's Assisi, where he was born. He was the son of, he was the son of a wealthy person. He was actually a party goer, a successful member of society. Everyone liked Francis, bit of a drunk, that sort of character. Then there was a civil war, and he ended up in prison for a couple of years. Did he get depressed? Was he traumatized from what happened in the war? There's a really good book about Francis by Augustine Thompson, which makes a good persuasive argument in those directions. But anyway, he's imprisoned, and when he comes out of prison, things seem to change. He goes back to his old friends, and it's not quite the same. He doesn't laugh as much when they go out drinking. He goes home early. It's not for him. He still seems to be a bit lost. And then he passes by this crucifix. Right? He goes by this church of San Damiano, and he sees this crucifix. And apparently it speaks to Francis, this very crucifix, which still survives. It speaks to Francis. And it says, "My house is falling down, repair it." So it's strange. Francis had a vision. I don't know how we understand it, but he starts to think that his job on earth is to repair churches, to make sure all the buildings are repaired. So he takes it literally, right? Which is, okay. But so he does that, and he pays a lot of attention to it. And then there's this dramatic moment where and there's this famous naked with the bishop moment, where one day he chooses to make this exhibition of himself in the market square in Assisi, and he strips himself naked. The legend is that he has sold something for his father and then decided to give the money to the poor instead of giving the money to his dad. His dad got angry, and then Francis just took all his clothes off and said, I'm done with all this. And the bishop comes out, and according to legend, the bishop, takes him into his arms. Yeah, let's not dwell, again, like that Christ image, let's not dwell too much on it, on the implications of it. It's just iconography. You can see another image of this here, this popular image. Many people used to laugh at him, this is the anonymous Perugia, insulting him with spiteful words. Almost everyone considered him mad, but he did not care, nor did he answer them. So Francis started just living on the streets now, kind of semi-clothed, and just kind of begging, well, not really begging, taking money from people that they would offer to him. And he would just sort of mumble to himself. He would say vague things about God. He would say vague things about needing to repair churches. But he became a laughingstock, and all his old friends that he used to drink with would go past and look, there he is again. It was a moment of huge humiliation. Someone who was at the top of society, now right at the bottom. Now a humiliating figure. Now someone you would rather pretend you didn't. I never really knew him that well, because he's embarrassing. This is what kind of happens. Eventually, there's this small church that the brothers, Francis actually attracts a couple of brothers at this early point, believe it or not. Giles and Peter, these others, Bernard. These men who join with him, and they all become his followers. So there's a few of them. It's like the Beatles. There's 4 of them, and that's it. And then they have this little church, the Portiuncula, and that's that. Okay, so they have a small building that they renovate and they kind of make their own. And this is their life. It's a little bit illegitimate seeming. If you were really the bishop and you really wanted to be upset about this, you could have been upset. Who are these guys? Are they claiming that they have some special order? It's a bit proud. What Francis actually does is he's really lost. He doesn't know what to do. And he thinks, well, maybe we are a new religious order, the 4 of us. Maybe like giving your clothes away and just kind of mumbling a bit and just living on the street. Maybe that's a new way of being a Christian. Maybe this is it. And you can understand it from all the stuff, St. Paul, in my weakness I am divine, or whatever. It makes sense from a Christian point of view. It's still a little bit weird. It's still a little bit potentially wrong from a Christian point of view. I think this is even more wrong, what he then decides to do. He goes to this church, and with the persuasion, he persuades the priest. He says, look, let's just open the Bible 3 times, and we'll choose 3 passages, and that's going to be how we're going to live our lives. They call it the Biblices Sortici. I know, it's ridiculous. And the guy says, yeah, it's great. It's like the Book of Answers. I don't know if you've ever done it. I'll open the book will tell me what to do. You ever done that? It's fun, you know. You could do it, you know. Whatever sentence we read, that's going to define our day, you know. But this is what Francis does. And the three passages are, it's kind of convenient what they are. They are these three. They are, number one, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me, from Matthew. Number two, if you will be perfect, go and sell what you have and give it to the poor. That's from Matthew again. And then from Luke, take nothing for your journey, neither staff nor knapsack, shoes nor money. This is where it begins, all right? And and of course you could say that all of this was made up later. It is convenient that they all go together so well. But anyway, this becomes the basis of the Franciscan life. It's not really a rule yet, it's just a form of life, it's just a way of being. And so they take this to be a validation of the fact that they should own nothing. That whatever it is to follow Francis and be one of his friends is to mean that you renounce all property, no property whatsoever. This is important, no property. And to be perfect, you have to go and give things to the poor. So let's just be really brief, and let's just go through it quickly. The doctrine of Franciscanism. He then goes to the Pope, right, and the Pope ratifies this form of life. It's difficult. It's weird that the Pope did it. It's the strongest Pope of the Christian era, Innocent III. He could easily have said, "You're all nutcases, go home," which I think he would have done in different circumstances. But there was something about Francis that he saw, there was great potential. Maybe it was the charisma. Maybe it was something else. The legend is that Innocent said, "Go away, you're all nutters," and then had a dream in which Francis of Assisi was holding the church up, the church itself, or the Vatican, I suppose, up with his hands. And Innocent woke up in a hot sweat and said, "Right, Francis, we have to let him do what he wants to do. It's God's will." That's the legend. Whatever it is, it could be quite strategic. The point is that Francis then has a life and then starts to preach this version of life. That to be a good Christian is the opposite of pride, right? Total humility, renounce everything. So here are his three principles that he lives by. By the way, the depression never really goes for Francis. It's one of my favourite image of Francis, the first one. He's a very, very sad figure. It doesn't go right for Francis. He's very sick. He's so sick with an eye condition that he has to have a hot iron and cauterize it. Someone puts a hot iron in his eye to try and remove the infection. He's always depressed. Do you know why? And it's fundamentally important. He started this thing which was about having nothing, being nothing. And then he ends up being the head of an order with hundreds and hundreds of people. And they all say, "What does Francis think we should do?" And he can't stand it. It's not what he wanted. It's not what you think the good Christian life should be about. Anyway, it's a big paradox. But anyway, what does Francis believe? Total poverty, number one. That's the easiest, I think. Own nothing. Although it sounds easy. But even monks own things, right? They have some possessions at some level. Or at least the monastic order that you belong to owns the building it lives in. For Francis, no, and it's really radical. You should own nothing at all. Nothing at all, not anything. Your shoes, they're not yours. It's important. And it extends to other things, like the food you eat. You should not buy it. You should not achieve it for yourself. It should be given to you. Mariam?
I can't grasp the difference between not know or not own something or believing that you don't own something. You know, like your shoes, they're not your shoes. Like difference between thinking that you don't own and not owning.
And this is what Pope John the 22nd said. There's no difference. Stop this radical poverty. If you're using shoes, you own them. Just stop saying you don't. That was how it goes for John the 22nd. But for Francis, no, it's very key. He has a thing called use value, user's pauper. I use things. I use it. And it's quite simple to understand. I don't own it, I use it. When it's shoes, okay, fair enough. But you accept that someone else could take those shoes and it's fine. You accept that you're just using them now and any second someone else could take them or you could lose them and it won't matter. But when it comes to like property, like a building, we don't own it, we use it. It's quite complicated. Okay, so that's one. And there's a great film, I think it's Zaffarelli's film of Francis and his brothers. This is the kind of life that they're leading, you know, owning nothing, like hanging out inside in the rain in the early days. Total humility, no pride at all. Radical humility is number two. I suppose, how does this work in practice? I've chosen this image actually also from Zaffarelli's film of like the friar throwing himself down on the floor. humility meant more than just, I own nothing, I'm so wretched, look at me, aren't I great? It's also about the embarrassment and humiliation. It's also part of it. And when Francis was on the street and everyone was laughing at him, that's quite an important part of this radical humility. You shouldn't be like dignified, like I am so austere, I live such a perfect life. There's a kind of dignity that attaches to you. For Francis, it needs to be punctured. Whenever it looks like you're getting a little bit proud of your situation, you need to puncture it. And how do you puncture it? Well, humour, actually. It's one of the ways. Mockery, self-mockery. The early Franciscans used to love a prank more than anything else. Like, so there was one guy who had these coins that were on a windowsill, and like they say, well, whose coins are they? Why are there coins here? And the one guy said, oh, well, they're my coins. I know I shouldn't have coins, but someone gave them to me, and I'm going to use them to, and of course, this is the problem. They shouldn't be your coins. You know, they're coins. We use them maybe, but probably not. You shouldn't say they're yours. And so Francis made this guy pick the coins up with his mouth, one by one, and spit them onto like this. There was like this dung heap, like animal droppings. It's a stupid little episode, but it's important. Humility means to humiliate yourself. It means that you don't even allow yourself the dignity. And stopping having dignity is really important. Other things like Francis's friend Giles used to strip naked a lot, which is a bit, you know, again, very odd. Like he would turn up, like there would be a formal gathering of bishops, and Giles would appear among them naked, and he would start to do a sort of spider dance, you know. It's all silly stuff. It's important to puncture the dignity of humility with humiliation for these early Franciscans. To be stupid, to be deliberately idiotic. My favourite story is the early Franciscans go on a preaching mission to Germany, and they say, what are we going to say? We're going to go to Germany, we're going to try and win people to become Franciscans. And they make a decision, just say yes to everything, ja, the German word, just say ja to everything we're asked. And so they ask them, do you want something to eat? Ja, they give them something to eat. Do you want to stay outside? Yeah, we'll stay outside in the rain. Are you all heretics? Do you believe in the radical sect of the Lombards? And they say, yeah, and they all get beaten. And like, this is a good moment for the Franciscans. It's like they wanted the humiliation. Like if we keep saying yes, we know something stupid's going to happen, but this is who we are. We're idiots for God. The other one is like, you know, these shepherds are chasing them off the land in Hungary, and they say, what do the shepherds want from us? And one of them says, I think they want all our clothes. So they take off their clothes, and they keep getting beaten. And then they take off more clothes, and they keep getting beaten. And then eventually say, I think what they really want is our underpants. That's what they want. So they give their underpants, and then the shepherds run away. But it's like a good moment, because it's like, it's classic Franciscan humiliation. Do not allow yourself to become puffed up, even in your simplicity and your holiness. Humour becomes the thing that saves you from being fond of yourself, mocking yourself. And then, form of life. This is the other thing that's important. I guess I don't have time to explain form of life. Agamben explains it very well. A life that is linked so closely to its form that it proves inseparable from it. Franciscans didn't follow a rule. Well, this was Francis's idea. There should be no rule for being a Franciscan. You should instead just do what Francis does, which is not to say do what he says. It's just follow and copy and imitate, and don't think it's a rule. You know, there's a distinction, but it's an important one between rule of life and form of life. Form of life cannot be reduced to principles. Like, because you can't get a document out and say, oh, but I am doing the same thing as you, because it says here to humiliate yourself once a week, and I'm doing that. You know, because that doesn't allow the subtle judgment of, is that following Francis? Form of life is much more different. It's like, is this the kind of thing? Is this what Francis seems to do? Are you in his spirit? You can make the distinction between letter and spirit from St. Paul in his letters. The rule of life is the letter of the law. Do what it says. The form of life is the spirit. Do what the law was intended to bring about. This is important for the Franciscans. What's it got to do with humility and pride? Well, the problem with laws and rules are there are people who know how to read them and are in control of them, and there are people who are not. Form of life arguably lends itself to a much more organic, decentralized structure of power. Is this what Francis would want? What do you think? What do you think? Does it seem to be? No one's in control of any document, which is important. How does it all end for the Franciscans? Oh, there they are all in their form of life, or animation, a rare example. I told you about the paradox. Things get really paradoxical. Francis retreats increasingly in his depression. He tries to get himself killed at one stage, which is to say he goes to Egypt on crusade and he tries to convert the Sultan to Christianity. And the penalty for trying to convert is death penalty. At least of all, trying to convert the Sultan. But actually, Francis does a little dance, and it's so funny that the Sultan forgives him, so it doesn't really work. Obviously, there's some debate. What was Francis trying to do? Was he trying to actually convert people? Was he trying to get himself killed? Was he trying to do something else? I don't know. It's another classic moment of humility. This happened, this famous event, the stigmata. Francis goes up onto a mountain, sees a vision of the six-winged angel, the seraphim. Is it 6 or 7 wings? 6, oh good. Always go with your gut instinct. And then he receives these wounds, the wounds of Christ on his body. This actually is an interesting phenomenon. We obviously don't have time to discuss it. For those of you who are interested in self-harm or the history of self-harm, or wonder what the mentality of self-destruction, how it looks throughout history, that is obviously one reading of this, self-mutilation. Intriguingly, there are many stigmatics after Francis. Intriguingly, it's a feminine phenomenon. Francis is the first prominent stigmatic who receives the wounds of Christ on his body. After this, it's often something that women, that manifests in women, whether they do it to themselves or they receive it miraculously is obviously not a historical question. Francis, many of even his enemies apparently say that there was a massive wound in Francis's side, that they saw it when he died. Even his enemies, he didn't have many enemies, but he did have a few. Even his enemies say that. So historians do accept that there was a wound. Whether it came from God or not is obviously a different question. The problem with the stigmata really is what happens to Francis's legend is he moves from being kind of just one among other mystical figures of great note to really having the marks of the great saint. And he is canonized very quickly after he dies. And then the stigmata, as you can see in all these different circumstances, becomes this icon, this iconic moment in Christian history. Stained glass windows, badges. This is a badge with the stigmata on it. You know, frescoes. This is Giotto's. Coins, even with the stigmata, or medals. And Francis himself becomes icon. The person who wanted to be nothing, less than nothing, total ash, worse than just ash because you're going to laugh at it, humiliated ash. Becomes great and noble, I know, what does that look like? Becomes great and noble Christian saint, the noblest and greatest of them all. There's a paradox here which I think is the most poignant version of this paradox is the Portiuncula, the little church that Francis had. And this is absolutely astonishing. Okay, so this is Francis's little church. It's deliberately small and, you know. So what happens to the little church when he dies and his legend grows is, of course, they build a massive church around it. So now you can go into this church in Assisi, and within that church is the little Portiuncula. And this symbolizes, this sums up in one simple image what happens to Francis's legend after he dies. He becomes more than great. He is the greatest of saints. He had the stigmata. He is like another Christ almost. Some even argue that Francis is the second Christ. Actually, that becomes a really big moment for civil war. We have these spiritual Franciscans, about 50 years after his death, the spiritual Franciscans who believe that the world is going to end in the year 1260, so less time after his death, or after 1260 comes and goes and the world doesn't end. They obviously adjust the date, it's going to happen here. They believe that there was an age of the Father, an age of the Son, and an age of the Holy Spirit. The time of the Father was the age of, up till Jesus' birth. The time of the Son was Jesus' birth to now, and now there is a new Jesus, which is Francis. So this is obviously heretical. This is obviously a problem. But these guys were willing to say, no, Christianity is moving forward. We've got to adjust. We've got to adapt. It's a new world. Things are changing. There's a new Christ. Obviously, you see the problem of pride here. If you're in the Augustinian tradition, you're a bit scared now. Well, hang on a second, this is going too far. The scriptures say that Christ is going to come back. It doesn't say that someone who acts a little bit like Christ is going to come and he's going to say, my name's Francis. It's a problem. It's a big, big problem. And people are predictably burnt at the stake for this, notably the 4 spiritual Franciscans who do not recant in Marseille in the early 1300s. So it's a tension. They often see it as the second, who is it? It's André Vaucher, the historian, sees it as the second death of Francis. Francis dies in the 1220s, but then dies again as his memory is destroyed, because everyone argues, what does his life mean? And this is quite interesting, really, and it gets us to attention in terms of the sin of pride. If Francis was committed to fighting pride, which I think we would all agree he was, right? In the sense that he actually had a double approach. Number 1, self-annihilation, become humble, become nothing, become ashes. Number 2, do not even allow yourself to be pleased with yourself for this, humiliate yourself. Double work. Later Franciscans, the death comes in removing that humiliation bit, in my argument. The death comes like, we should see Francis as a great example, like Augustine told us to, of fighting pride, by humbling the self. And this is a good example, but let's not be too radical about it. And so a lot of Franciscans are now university professors. They're very high-ranking people. There's even a Franciscan pope in the 14th century. And these guys, they do not try to humiliate themselves. They still accept that some level of institutional pride is necessary. They're much more maybe like Thomas, is equilibrium. But Francis saw some radical power in the opposite of pride, in total humiliation of the self. Angela, we'll just really say something briefly about Angela, because she is a Franciscan tertiary who takes Francis' ideas to a new level. Angela actually adds an erotic dimension to all of this. In her Memoriale, the famous, she's Italian, much like Francis, she's from the same region. There's a bizarre passage in Angela of Foligno's Memoriale, which is kind of like an autobiography, where, and again, self-harm, she describes how there was a flame that she felt within her. She felt this flame. She says it's like a flame of lust, but I suppose it could be a flame of pride too. But she says she hates this flame. She feels it working within her, so she took another flame and she put it where the flame was. She set fire to her own genitals just for one moment. But then, I don't know, the story cuts off, we move on. I presume she was okay. It tells us something, I think, about this humiliation and self-annihilation, that sometimes, guys, the line blurs between annihilating yourself as your view of yourself and annihilating the body of the self. For Marguerite Porete, when she was being burnt at the stake, was she thinking, this is a good thing? This is a good thing in a way, because I'm finally being annihilated. I'm finally becoming one with God. If you read some of these other Franciscan writers, like Robert Grosseteste, not really a Franciscan, but a friend of the Franciscans, God was made of fire. Fire was the substance at the height of the universe, the substance of the heavens. So that's a question for you to think about, maybe, or maybe to look at in some research. But Angela performs this humiliation on self. No, this destruction of self. There is an erotic dimension, as I promised. She also has this almost Bernard of Clairvaux style, eros. She describes how she strips herself naked in front of the cross. And it's this love which drives her. A fascinating element. Let's just read one quotation. Jesus Christ, God and man, wished to be despised, ill-treated, and to appear to all in such an extreme state of derision for the very purpose of removing it from this state of derision. All this was perfectly realized in the person of our Father, Blessed Francis. What I would say to you is that Angela gets it, in the sense, what do the Franciscans mean? The powerful men in Angela's life, like Bonaventure, who had been the Minister General before she was writing, would say, no, the message of Francis is the principles that he left us, the principle of humility. You should oppose pride with the principle of humility, and we should follow that principle. Angela remembers that there was something more complex than a principle at play. There was an embodied way of dealing with sin in life, which involved radical tactics and practices according to situations. A principle means when you say, this is going to be my guiding star through all situations, right? If I'm a principled Marxist, this will be my first port of call when I consider historical development. If you're principled about humility, you might have a series of principles, right? This is what humility means. Francis was not principled in that way, and I think Angela understands it here. He believed that in a situation, you combat that situation according to what comes to you. All right, there are principles involved, but it's much more irreducible. There is a relationship with God, a relationship with self, which will be performed and enacted differently in different situations. In this one, for Francis, like one situation is putting a coin in your mouth and spitting it out. Another situation is stripping naked, might be the strategy. For Angela, maybe putting a flame to your genitals is the strategy. I hope it's not the strategy for any of us, ever. But it's a strategy. This is, I think, an important difference. And of course, she also gets the point about derision and humiliation. That is, there actually is an image here. It's just too dark for you to see. That is it. How do we reflect on these two guys? How do we reflect on Francis and Bernard, and on Hadwick, on Marguerite Porete, and on Angelo Foligno? I think at the very essence, all I want to say is that you see that there were different strategies for fighting pride, that pride could be understood and conceptualized in very, very different ways according to different circumstances, that it means something to be fighting pride in a monastery where you're thinking thoughts, contemplating, praying, seeking God out in your heart, to when you're Francis of Assisi and you're in a strange situation, like a gathering of bishops, like a market square, like meeting your dad, like meeting your old friends, and you fight pride in that situation. These things are very different. And of course, their vision of what pride is. Bernard wants to annihilate all sense of self-worth and redirect that sense of self-worth that was there towards God. So maybe it's not so much annihilation. Francis, conversely, wants to humiliate the self, which is an extra layer, which is not there for Bernard. And the difference between those two might be crucial. Okay, that's it, guys. You did it. You got through the whole lot. Do you have any questions? I could obviously speak for hours about these guys. And we can, if you like. It's only Saturday. You've got a whole other weekend day. Any questions that you might have? Arseny?
So, isn't being Franciscan is actually destructive? Because when you humiliate yourself, when you embarrass yourself, you basically force other people to be proud of them. So it's like the first step in the whole staircase of pride.
Yeah.
Isn't it like the absolute opposite of what they are trying to do?
Yes, so you mean the Franciscans are like the opposite of that staircase of pride because they're being curious, they're accentuating differences. So if I'm on the street and I'm humble and you walk past, I'm accentuating the difference. Like, I'm drawing attention to the fact that you're not doing that. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a very good point. And it's an excellent point to contextualize, like Bernard of Clairvaux's life. He's in a monastery with other monks. He's not seeing people in the street. It's not important to him. He's withdrawn. His ideal is that everyone else should become like him. Francis, the question remains, is he trying to reform people through this? If you are Franciscan and you're humiliating yourself, on the floor, do I want you to join me and become like me so that we're all doing that? But if you do that, then what happens? It's lost its power, hasn't it? If we're all on the floor, then how are you humbling and humiliating yourself? It's which goes back to what I said about it's situational. Maybe in that situation there would be some different strategy. But it's a good point, and I think, if Bernard and Francis had overlapped in time, I think Bernard would be pretty disgusted by some of the behaviour. He would see it as exhibitionist. He would see it as self-aggrandizing, maybe. Francis would think Bernard didn't go far enough. Any other questions? Anne?
Going back to the Lucifer, I wonder what the particular difference between angels and people from the point of view of Middle Ages. As far as I thought, angels do not have will, however, people do. And that's where sin comes from. That's why angels are not sinners, because they don't have a free will. However, Lucifer decided that he is more superior than God, and that's his sin of pride. So he was the only one with free will, or angels do have free will, and if so, what makes them different from people?
And you should totally be a theologian. You're so on the same page as these theologians, right? You anticipate the problem. This is why, and this is a problem for theologians early on, right? So angels are perfect; they don't have free will, right? In the sense that they're not human, so they don't have the will of the humans. And yet Lucifer makes a mistake, which means he must have some free will. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a mistake. It wouldn't be hubris. It wouldn't be pride. It wouldn't be worth talking about. If it was just God created the world and then immediately sent some guy down, then there's no story for us to learn from, is there? It's just another agent. So there is a theological discussion about this where they say, well, yes, there is this moment where there is will among the early angels, and some choose to follow God and some choose to go against, like Lucifer. And so the angels who, and this is where it gets a little bit silly maybe, the angels who chose to stay loyal then have an extra dimension of their holiness. So there's a hierarchy of angels, and the ones who chose to rebel obviously then are damned, and the ones who are apathetic or whatever. So there's this. But this is a classic example of how Christian theology works, maybe all theology. You have a system, and then someone with a brilliant mind like yourself, Anne, recognizes this doesn't work, and then we need new systems. We need new ways of thinking about it. We create more writing which explains this, but the tension remains, and then some people believe this, some people believe that. And then what often happens is actually we get literature which expands on this. So we have like this tension, it's not clear, so people start to make up stories apocryphally that kind of elaborate the myth. And that's what happens with Lucifer, And Dante is like the ultimate story maker. I mean, it doesn't say anywhere that the creator made a mountain, which we call purgatory. In fact, it doesn't say anything about purgatory for that matter either. That's another thing that people invent because it seems to work, but there's no mention of purgatory in the Bible. But if there's no purgatory, then how can you pray for souls? What are you praying for? There has to be a waiting room. So what does that waiting room look like? Well, you see, this is how purgatory emerges. So yeah, good point insofar as it anticipates this struggle, to elaborate a theory that works.
Is it proper to fanfics to fix the holes in the plot of the story?
Yes, very similar. Fan fiction. I think any other questions? I think we're at time. You can come and ask me questions now, but we can take a break. Have a good weekend, what's left of it. When is our next meeting?